Chapter 13 covers the brain and the nerves that attach to the brain, which we call cranial nerves. As you can imagine, the brain is much more complicated than the spinal cord, and cranial nerves can be a little more difficult to learn than spinal nerves. So you really want to focus heavily on this chapter. So we're going to cover topics such as the four major regions of the brain, the brain stem, which includes the medulla oblongata, pons, and midbrain, the diencephalon, which includes the thalamus, hypothalamus, and epithalamus, the cerebellum, which will look at the white matter and the gray matter and the overall function of the cerebellum. And then we spend most of our time on the cerebrum. So this is the largest part of the brain. It's divided into 5 lobes, and we're going to look at the different functional areas of the cerebrum. We'll talk about the meninges again. We'll look at the similarities and differences between the layers that surround the brain and the layers that surround the spinal cord. We'll talk a little more about cerebral spinal fluid, where it's produced, who produces it, a little bit of the function, and then where it flows through the CNS. And then finally, we learn about the 12 pairs of cranial nerves. So let's begin and just introduce the 4 major regions. This is a very common image of the brain that we use to identify most parts. The cerebrum is this larger area here. It has these grooves, so we use the word sulcus to explain the grooves. And then the folds, those are called a gyrus. So it's got these little folds and grooves in it. Again, it's divided into lobes, which we'll take a look at in a future slide. It does a lot of the higher level function of the brain, perception, thought, memory, emotion, and conscious motor control. Then we'll look at the diencephalon. So the diencephalon is this central area that you really can only identify if you were to look inside the brain. You can't see it from the surface. And that diencephalon is going to be divided into 3 parts: the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the epithalamus. The brainstem, we'll kind of work our way up the brainstem, but it's the part of the brain that's attached to your spinal cord. It has 3 parts as well: the medulla oblongata, the pons, and the midbrain. And the cerebellum. The cerebellum, that word means little brain, because when you look at the brain, it kind of looks like you got a big one and then a little one here. That one's going to regulate some muscle activity, maintain posture, balance, and coordination. All right, so let's begin with the brainstem. We're just going to use these kind of simplified drawings, but you'll notice we're going to work our way up the brainstem from the spinal cord. So the first part of the brainstem is the medulla oblongata. There's 3 main things I want you to remember, even though it does a lot more. So every part of the brain we're going to cover does a lot more than what we're going to learn. You would have to take a whole semester or 2 class to get into all the details. But the medulla oblongata is best known for what we would call vital control centers. Vital meaning you can't live without them. So it's got control centers for breathing, and we'll revisit a lot of this stuff in A&P 2. So a lot of what we learn in the nervous system is going to spill over into A&P 2 because the nervous system controls all these organs that we learn about in A&P 2. So in order to breathe faster, slower, we use control centers in the medulla oblongata. It also is in charge of your cardiovascular system, so it's going to control the heart. It regulates how strong the heart's going to beat, as well as how fast it's going to beat. So it can speed it up, slow it down, make it beat harder, in order to either pump more blood throughout your cardiovascular system or pump less blood. It also regulates the blood vessels, so that's the vascular part. It can control the diameter of the blood vessels. This is one way we can regulate blood pressure as well as blood flow. And then it also has some reflex centers. So the reflex centers that the medulla is in charge of is coughing, swallowing, vomiting, hiccuping, and sneezing. All right, so moving up from the medulla, there's an area called the pons. Pons means bridge-shaped. It's kind of a larger, almost looks swollen area of the brainstem. And it basically attaches everything below it to things above it. So it has a lot of ascending and descending tracts that send signals, up to, say, the cerebrum, or bring those signals down, eventually down the spinal cord. So it kind of relays a lot of impulses between different parts of the brain and then down to the spinal cord. It also will assist the medulla in breathing. So there's a lot of little centers that regulate breathing. Breathing isn't just rate, it's also depth. The pons is involved in modifying your breathing, not just the rate, but more the depth of breathing. And then the midbrain is above the pons. The midbrain has a couple different parts. One is known as the cerebral peduncles. A peduncle is an attachment, and the cerebral peduncles basically attaches, everything below to everything above. So it kind of, again, it's going to help bring signals up and down the brainstem. And then it has two very interesting structures called the colliculi. Colliculi are these little mounds that stick off the back of the midbrain. So it's kind of hard to see on this drawing. We'll identify them on a bigger drawing. But right back here, posterior, are these little, there almost looks like little mounds, little roundings of the midbrain. And they're involved in two specific types of reflexes. The superior colliculi are involved in reflexes in response to a visual stimulus. So, for example, if something is coming towards you, maybe very fast, you want to be able to identify it very quickly. So it helps orient your eyes onto that object and then respond to that. So maybe you have to move out of the way, or maybe if it's, let's say it's a baseball and you're at a baseball game, maybe you'll respond by catching the ball or at least protecting yourself from that visual stimulus. And then below it are the inferior colliculi. Very similar. It's a quick reflex, involuntary response, more to a sound. So the stimulus is auditory. So here, you hear a loud bang and you kind of jump or move out of the way. That's using that inferior colliculi. All right, so that's the brainstem. Next region we're going to talk about is the diencephalon. So cephalon means brain. Di obviously means two, so it's named after two brain, but there's actually three parts to it. There's the thalamus, which is kind of this central area. Below it is the hypothalamus. And then kind of above and behind it is the epithalamus. The thalamus is best known, again, it does a lot of other things, as a relay center, or kind of like a gateway. And it's a relay center for sensory signals. So you've got a lot of senses coming into your brain, right? You might have touch, temperature, vision, hearing, pain. All these things go into the brain, but you need someone to relay it to the appropriate areas. And that's the job of the thalamus. So a lot of signals go to it, and then it will relay it to the cortex. The cerebral cortex is the part of the cerebrum that does a lot of the interpretation of your senses. All right. Now, notice the one sense, I mean, there's a few others, but the main sense that doesn't need to get relayed is your sense of smell or olfaction. So olfaction actually avoids going to the thalamus, and it's going to go directly to the area of your cerebrum that is involved in interpreting what you smell. It also has some role in mood and movement, But its job is basically it does the perception, but it doesn't do much of the interpretation or localization of pain. So, for example, if you didn't have a cerebrum and you had some sort of painful stimulus, you would know you're in pain. You just wouldn't be able to interpret it or be able to figure out where the pain's coming from. So the interpretation and localization of pain is done using your cerebral cortex. That's what we mean by cortical processing. Just perceiving that, man, I'm in pain, is actually your thalamus. So I always thought that was kind of interesting. So you have to perceive it, but then you have to interpret and localize it, figure out where it is. So just the perception of pain is your thalamus, but then it needs to relay that signal in order for interpretation and localization. So the key thing here is in red, right? It's a relay center or a gateway for a lot of our incoming senses. Hypothalamus. We talk a lot about the hypothalamus in A&P2 because it has a lot of the control centers for homeostasis, maintaining a lot of the internal conditions of the body. For example, body temperature is regulated at the hypothalamus. So if we need to try to maybe fight an infection, one thing we can do is turn up the body temperature, and that causes a fever. And a fever is going to help stimulate our immune system to be even better. And it also needs to know what our body temperature is. So, or also the environment. So when you walk outside and it's brutally hot, well, that temperature sense goes to your hypothalamus, and then your hypothalamus knows that we need to start cooling the body, so we need to go stimulate sweating. So it helps regulate body temperature. It also helps regulating eating, so it has a hunger center in there to make sure that you're going to maintain nutrient levels. And then it also has a thirst center. So your hypothalamus is always monitoring whether you're dehydrated or not. And if you're dehydrated, it's going to trigger thirst. It's also going to trigger and produce a hormone that helps retain fluid in the body. And that hormone is called ADH, or anti-diuretic hormone. But hormones are a big topic in A&P2. So when we start off in A&P2, we learn about the endocrine system, and we really start at the hypothalamus because it's a main regulator of your entire endocrine system. It does this by largely controlling and giving hormones to the pituitary gland. So you'll notice that sticking down from the hypothalamus is a gland known as the pituitary. And that pituitary has two distinct lobes to it. There's an anterior portion and a posterior portion. The hypothalamus will control the anterior pituitary. Basically tells it when to produce hormones, when not to produce hormones. But then it also will be involved in the posterior pituitary, but more in just giving that pituitary two hormones. One's known as ADH, and the other one is oxytocin. So we'll learn more about hormones in A&P2, but for now we just need to know that the hypothalamus has a direct relationship with that endocrine system. So the hypothalamus is interesting in that it plays a huge role in both the nervous system and the endocrine system. So we often think of it as a link. So it's kind of the linker between your two controlling systems, right? Everything's controlled by nervous system and hormones, right? That's how we regulate and control the body. But the hypothalamus plays a role in both. So it's very important in kind of connecting those two systems so they know what each other are doing. And then the epithalamus. The epithalamus, really, we just need to remember basically one major thing, and that it has a gland sticking off the back of it called the pineal gland. And the pineal gland produces one hormone known as melatonin. And melatonin helps control your wake and sleep cycle, or your night and day cycle, or we also call this your circadian rhythm. All right, and how it works is it goes up in the evening. All right, so basically light is involved, right? Your eyes capture that light, and that tells your brain that it's daytime. And melatonin levels will go down when there's light. All right, so it helps you kind of wake up in the morning when it's low. But then when it gets dark outside, melatonin levels go up and they help you sleep. All right, so that's how melatonin is kind of helping your night and day cycling. And sometimes people supplement with it. It can be bought, over the counter at supplement stores, CVS's, and stuff like that. And the idea is if you take it in the evening, it might help you sleep at night. Evidence is kind of unclear whether it actually works or not. Some people swear by it, some people don't. And again, the scientific studies are very unclear whether it works or not. But we hope it at least doesn't hurt people, because it's a supplement and it's not really FDA regulated. So it's not really studied very intensively through clinical trials and things like that. So it's a supplement, so you're kind of rolling the dice as far as its safety. Okay, cerebellum. So we'll do the cerebellum and then we'll start a new video on the cerebrum. So again, the cerebellum is located posterior to the brainstem. So here's your brainstem, here's the cerebellum. It has two hemispheres, so it kind of like the cerebrum, we can think of it as two, a right hemisphere and a left hemisphere. It's got very distinct different tissues on the inside. So this is probably my favorite picture because it clearly shows the white matter surrounded by gray matter. All right, so the white matter on that interior of the cerebellum has a name. It's called the arbor vitae. Arbor means tree, vitae means life. So that means kind of the living tree or tree of life inside the cerebellum. So that's the white matter. And then it's surrounded by the cerebellar cortex. Now, cortex is a word we use quite a bit. Cortex just means an outer layer. So the cerebellum has a cortex, the cerebrum has a cortex, and both of those are gray matter. And remember, gray matter does more of the interpretation, the analysis of information, whereas white matter is more just sending signals very quickly. The surface, you can kind of see right here, the surface has folds, which are called folia. So that's a little bit of the anatomy when you look at the cerebellum. What does it do? Well, it controls precise muscle movements and muscle tone. So overall control of muscle is done at an area in your cerebrum called the primary motor area. But it communicates directly with the cerebellum. So there's a communication between the cerebellum, the cerebrum, as well as your body movements, your proprioceptors. And all this is analyzed, but your cerebellum is more controlling very precise, so balance, coordination. That's the key. So maintains balance and coordination. All right, so it gets impulses from your cerebral cortex and your joints and muscle. Those are the proprioceptors. So it helps in kind of just adding that level of precision, balance, and coordination to your muscle activity. Damage to it or suppression of the cerebellum with alcohol has a very clear consequence. You'll lose your balance, you'll lose your coordination, you'll lose your equilibrium. So when we look at, someone who's drunk, they lose coordination, balance. And that's due to the suppression of the cerebellum. So alcohol is an overall nervous system suppressant. So it suppresses a lot of your nervous system. But one thing we can actually use as a determination as to whether someone is drunk or not is its effect on the cerebellum. So they can do those tests to determine whether you've lost some coordination and equilibrium. So sobriety tests. All right, so there's your cerebellum. Next video, we're going to talk about the cerebrum. And again, that's the big part of your brain. It does a lot of our upper level, high level function. So we spend quite a bit of time